Becoming Dr. Bereiter. To your sister Joan, you have always been a head-in-the-clouds genius. You seem to have the imagination and talent to become a cartoonist or a classical pianist. Yet you concentrated on literature, reading it, writing it, and comparing it. Why did you turn to education?
Oh, well, you know, I stuck with literature through a master's degree. I really did want to be a writer, and I spent, during my last 2 years in university, I realized I'm spending too much time on my schoolwork. So I set up this routine where I would do it 1 week, and then the next week I would write, and then the next week I'd do the schoolwork. But getting into education, I was already drifting very much in the direction of psychology, of what would now be called cognitive psychology, though the name didn't exist then. Because I was curious about, well, particularly about writers, how they tick, how does original work come out of the writing process? And so that's what I wanted to pursue. I don't think we really got to pursuing that until Marlene and I were doing research in the late 1970s on writing, and finally tackling some of those things that had been in the back of my mind for the preceding 20 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What brought you to the University of Wisconsin?
Pardon?
You went to the University of Wisconsin.
Yes. Yeah, for both my comparative literature work and then back for education.
And then what brought you to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign?
Well, in between times, I had I was a research postdoc, I guess you'd say, with the Mary Conover Mellon Foundation at Vassar College, where a famous psychologist named Nevitt Sanford had run a study on personality development in the college years, and they hired me as one of them said, to keep them honest. That's about how much virtue they saw in statistical analysis. And but as I worked there for those 2 years, I came to realize, you know, that is about all it's good for. That if you're going to make a difference in education, you need to get out there and do experiments. You've got to try things that may fail, and work to design things that are better. So when the Vassar study was wrapping up, and I was looking around for jobs, and Illinois offered one, and I thought, from what I knew of the people there, this is a place to go to learn how to do experiments. Because I didn't know. I hadn't had any experience whatsoever in doing experiments. And got there and was certainly encouraged to do this. Although, well, my first funded research was buying a baby chimpanzee and getting somebody to try to teach it finger spelling. Other people had taught, you know, sign language, mm-hmm. But thought maybe we could teach it to spell. And I remember telling colleagues, and they had a very powerful measurement and statistics division in the College of Ed, telling him about the study, and he said, "What are you going to use for a control group?" That so stunned me that I didn't answer. But when I told this anecdote many years later to a labor leader, he said, "You should have said a chicken." And that would have been the perfect answer.
Jean Osborn. She worked as a teacher and program developer within a preschool, which was mm-hmm. your second research project after the chimpanzee study, mm-hmm. which eventually turned out to be the Bereiter Engelmann preschool project. The woman who told her to work with you told her, a nut like you might get along with a nut like Carl Bereiter. What was this preschool about, and how did you use humor to teach kids?
Well, I don't know who called Jean Osborn a nut, because the main thing she brought to our preschool project was sanity.
Relatively.
She was very level-headed and knew how to deal with the practical world. Getting those kids bused to a school, even getting them rounded up and identified and so on, those were the kinds of things that she was really good at. Using humor, there was virtually no irrelevant humor, but we did keep a light touch while the kids were working very, very hard, because the basic idea there was, again, a very simple and non-psychological one, and that was, here are kids who are already at the age of 4 or 5, way behind middle-class kids in development of things like number and learning the alphabet and so on. It isn't enough for them to learn as rapidly as middle-class kids do. If they're going to catch up, they've got to learn faster. And so that was the whole idea of this thing. So the kids did work hard, but it was in bursts of 15 minutes, and then in between times we'd do fun activities, play games and so on. And Siegfried Engelmann, as a teacher, was always, he couldn't not be funny, with the kids. And at the same time, though, he's a very powerful teacher in the sense that they really, when they sat down there, they knew they were going to work very hard. But he had these little kids using the multiplication table that was pinned up from them to do multiplication problems. And then there was this one who answered very fast when he posed the problem. And I heard him. He asked him, "How did you do that?" "Well, it was in here." And Siggy said to all the rest of them, "You know what's happened? What he's telling you? He's got that multiplication table in his head. Now, do you think you could get it there?" And these kids immediately set about trying to get the multiplication table in their head. Now, that maybe doesn't sound so impressive, but if you've been in many schools where in 3rd grade they half teach the multiplication table, and in the 4th grade they half teach it again, and then in the 5th grade again they half teach it, by which time Zeno's paradox has taken over. They're never going to get there. Turning it into a social kind of event. Well, this isn't about humor. This is about powerful teaching, which was really what we were about.
Sure. Thought you were going to come up with a joke.
No.
Okay. Siegfried Engelmann, you referred to him before. When I contacted him, he expressed that during your work together at this preschool, funny things happened every day. One day after your daily music period, you played the piano and Zig led the singing. A piano key stuck and you tried to unstick it. A handful of preschoolers watched with great interest in terms of what you were doing. One was an energetic 5-year-old named James. He pointed to the strings and asked you, "What's that?" You showed James what happened when you pressed the single key. Then you said, with a bit of bravado, "And if you press more than one key at a time like this," and you ripped off a couple of snappy chords, "it makes music, doesn't it?" And James replied, "Damn straight." With Zig, or Ziggy, I think you referred to him as before, you collectively added a new term to the vocabulary of pedagogical argumentation, direct instruction. How did that come about?
Well, it was just a direct, descriptive term for what we were doing. By direct, the term is now in fairly wide use, and people seem to think that it's behaviorist. No, this was totally a theoretical. And B, that it involves some kind of hammering things into kids' heads. No, it was have a learning objective, which in these cases was identify something the kids need to learn that they don't know, and teach it to them by the most direct path you can have. Fine, one that wastes the least effort in getting there. But we needed a term to describe it. Actually, the term we used was direct verbal instruction. Not that we had anything against manipulatives and so on, but that was a distinguishing feature because very little of preschool education at that time took the verbal route as, well, even being one that little kids could travel. Of course, everybody believes in talking to the kids, but the notion that you could tell them things and expect them to apply them and remember was a bit radical at that time. I think it isn't anymore, but it was then.
Would you describe yourself as a behaviorist?
No. Well, when I was at Vassar, I got hold of Skinner's book, Science and Human Behavior, I think it's called. And for a period of a good 3 weeks, I was an ardent behaviorist because he made everything seem so clear and plausible and so on. But by the time I was into the actual preschool work and so on, it was very clear that behaviorism didn't have the answers. By that time, Skinner was publishing schedules of reinforcement, and this was really about conditioning pigeons and chickens and creatures like that. But it goes through all of these schedules and is very scientific. And then at the end, in an appendix, was how to teach the bird to peck the grain that you want. And it had a lot of simple things they'd found worked that had absolutely nothing to do with behaviorism and the theory and so on. That was just plain teacher lore for teachers of pigeons. And it became clear that behaviorism was riding very high at that time, but it was to a large extent phony because you had to get the pigeon to peck first before you could reinforce it. And the whole notion, problem of how you get children or pigeons up to the point where they are doing something that you want to reinforce lay outside it. I remember Dick Atkinson giving a presentation on the elaborate scheme they had for designing an educational sequence. And it was a kind of flow chart, lines running all over and so on. And I asked, but where is the part where you plan what actually is done to get the kids to learn something, the material? And he said, oh, well, over here in this little box that was kind of off the track, in that box there's a teacher. And we have the teacher plan the lessons. So it just didn't do it. But, in those days, in the popular educational wisdom, you were either a behaviorist or you were a Piagetian, and you couldn't be anything else. So you were either in league with the devil or you were on God's side. That's what it basically came down to. And I didn't find, although I found Piaget extremely interesting, and in fact would have originally have gone to Geneva right after my doctorate if I didn't already have a young family that needed some support and so on. But it didn't really offer anything of direct application. And the people who tried to be using Piaget in early childhood education were really not doing anything much more than taking his test tasks and having the kids do them.
Sure.
And then do them some more.
Sure.
So actually, I did in fact publish an article that was criticizing both behaviorism and Piaget. One of my colleagues wrote a rejoinder saying that he thinks I'm still a connectionist. He was a little out of date in his language because I didn't object to it strongly enough.
Tell us about Marlene Scardamalia, who happens to be in the audience with us today.
Well, she's been inseparable from both my life and work for 30-some years now. And she first arrived as a researcher, hired on our research project. And she'll tell you the sad story of how she worked herself to the bone and got no credit for it because her results were showing that our program wasn't working. I didn't actually blame her for showing that. Instead, I said, well, there's no use wasting any more time on this program. Her results were conclusive to my mind. And then when I went around to visit classrooms and saw what they were doing, it was clear why it was failing. So we did something else. We collaborated in some cognitive research for a while because she'd done cognitive development for her doctorate. And then we got into writing research and a whole continuum of things that's led up to the present day.
You have 35 plus years being together, many of which you have been married and doing research together. Of what are you most proud in terms of your research together?
Well, I think the development of knowledge building as a distinctive educational approach is the main thing. That's what we believe has a future. And we're recruiting over the years very good scholars and innovators around the world who can tune into it. There's an association for knowledge building in Italy with an Italian name. There is a center for it in Helsinki at the university there, and a number of it's very active in Hong Kong and Singapore and so on. And all of these people are contributing to what I think is eventually going to be what the 21st century recognizes it needs educationally. So that's the main thing. The single key piece of work, I think, was what we did on writing research that turned a corner, and that was although very few people who were doing writing research had any questions in mind, we did have one, and that is, how are kids able to write as well as they do, given how little thinking they apparently do while they're writing? And we found an answer. I mean, it's the knowledge-telling model. It's a marvelous system for doing writing assignments in school. It isn't good for anything else, but it's very good for doing school writing assignments. And one of the characteristics of it is that it leaves your knowledge essentially untouched. You draw on your knowledge to write, but the writing doesn't affect your knowledge. Whereas with mature and expert writers, it does. And they'll often tell you probably all experienced this yourself, that in the course of writing an article or an essay or developing an argument and so on, your beliefs change or are refined or progress. You come out of it knowing more than you did before. And kids weren't getting this. And so that's where our attention really shifted, away from teaching them how to write better, to getting them engaged in a process that involved writing, but where the ideas were at the center, and reflection on those ideas and development of the ideas. And so that one piece of research certainly turned our thinking in a different direction on it. And it's probably one of the most frequently cited research findings that we've had, too. I mean, so it wasn't just us privately thinking, hey, this is something worthwhile. Other people have latched onto it, too.
Sure. Who else is cited? Who is Mr. Sleeby?
Oh, Mr. Sleeby. Well, he's a character in a series of thinking stories that I produced, but with help from others, particularly Marlene helped out in the writing of some of them were mathematical thinking stories. I created a host of characters, all of whom had cognitive deficits of one sort or another. That is, there was, one kid is very hasty and jumps to conclusions. Another thinks everything is magic. Sleeby's problems were that he was the ultimate concrete thinker. He couldn't handle abstractions at all. He also had a remarkable tendency to forget things and be out of contact with the physical world. So my collaborators in the math program have insisted that those Sleeby stories are actually autobiographical.
So I've heard. In fact, we have 2 excerpts, which talks to exactly what you just described them as. The first excerpt: if I have 5 apples and eat 2 of them, how many apples do I have left? That's easy, said Mr. Sleeby. 5 apples. What do you think the answer was supposed to be? Perhaps you didn't hear the question. I said I have 5 apples and eat 2 of them. Exactly, said Mr. Sleeby. Then you have 5 apples, 3 on the outside and 2 on the inside. Excerpt number 2. How many eggs in a dozen? You are going to ask what kinds of eggs, right? You read my mind exactly, Mr. Sleeby said. A dozen is a dozen, no matter what it is a dozen of. Do you know how much that is? Give me a hint, said Mr. Sleeby. All right. It's the same as the number of fingers on your hands, plus 2. 2 what? 2 fingers. You mean to say that a dozen eggs is 12 fingers, said Mr. Sleeby. I find that very hard to believe.